Hey everyone, I am here to summarize chapters 8 and 9 from our Concepts of Coercion book. And to start out, chapter 8 was titled Avoidance. And this chapter primarily talks about what avoidance is and how it's similar to escape. He also goes into talking about what causes avoidance. So those are the primary talking points for this summary. To start out, it's explained that when hit with punishment, we pretty much do anything that we can to get away from it. And if we're unable to escape that punishment, we may drop out in order to avoid it altogether. Even if that means we might lose reinforcement that might come from being there. An example that I really loved that he talked about was when we're kids or children, we don't really wait for our parents to scold us when we do something negative or bad. We hide, we run away, we do whatever we can to avoid that punishment. So to quote Sidman, much of our negatively reinforced behavior, therefore, seems supported by the prevention rather than the cessation of life's shocks. So essentially, what he's saying is that how we discriminate between escape and avoidance, escape essentially means that you experience the negative behavior and you do whatever you can to escape it. Avoidance means that you try to do everything in your power to avoid that negative reinforcement before it even happens. An example I like is when you're in the classroom, you see that kid throwing the paper at the wall or tapping their pencil. They're trying to escape the work. Avoidance would be not showing up to class at all. They are completely avoiding that classroom or that negative behavior, that negative punishment. He states that avoidance is another form of negative reinforcement. According to some lab studies, the successful avoidance often comes as a secondary consequence of escaping negative consequences previously. So usually escape comes after or before avoidance. So the first section of chapter 8 is titled The Causes of Avoidance. And to start out, he says that lab studies that show specific features of avoidance, and it would be challenging to observe that in any other way. The first experiment that he talked about was when a light was illuminated in a rat's cage, and essentially the rat would get a brief shock, and after the light was on for 5 seconds. But if they're able to pull the lever before the light goes out, then they don't get the shock. They pull the lever, they avoid that uncomfortable sensation. People do that too. They learn a new behavior to avoid the uncomfortable one. Avoidance, he explains, is more adaptive than is more of an adaptive adjustment to punishment than is escape. And it's logical to prevent a shock rather than escape it after it's begun. So if you can avoid it altogether, why experience the shock and then escape it? It kind of makes sense. According to this lab experience, we don't learn to press avoidance levers before experiencing the shock. So we wouldn't just know how to pull that lever if we didn't experience the shock prior. So therefore, the first cause of avoidance is our past and our past experiences. And the second cause of avoidance is the present. Avoidance is an inevitable outcome of coercion, he says. So in order to correctly identify avoidance as coercion, we must first recognize the problem behavior as avoidance. And secondly, we must analyze both the past and present contingencies that may have kept it going, which is going to be really difficult and hard to identify, which makes it seem like the future orientation of avoidance let myths kind of come into our language about avoidance. And these myths that he explains are expectancies as causes and fear and anxiety as causes of avoidance. And those are myths, and he goes into pretty great detail about those. And then the final section of chapter 8 was titled Avoidance Without Warning Signals. A second lab experiment was done, and it shows the more subtle causes of avoidance, but it also laid the foundation for analysis of coercion and its side effects into a wider context. He says that as humans, we are not always warned when we're about to be punished. Sometimes it's unexpected. We aren't ready for it, so there's really no way to avoid it. So in this experiment that they had set up, a lab rat starts out by getting a brief shock every 20 seconds, and there's no signal for that shock before it's due. So as in the last experiment, there is a lever that can keep the shock from happening, but they don't know when it's happening, so it makes it more difficult. So every time the lever is pulled, it postpones the shock. Therefore, pulling the lever allows them to adapt successfully from avoiding that shock. Now, as an outsider, if you were to sit there and watch this rat just pulling a lever every 20 seconds, and you wouldn't see the signal of the light because there isn't one, you wouldn't really know why they're just sitting there pulling a lever. So you might wonder why they're doing this. You don't know those past events that are causing it. You didn't see the shocks happening, which really demonstrates that you rarely see the immediate results of someone's avoidance behaviors. You can only make guesses as to why the avoidance behavior is occurring, which makes it really difficult to see the coercion in lab settings, and it makes it even more difficult to see it in real world settings. So that is my summary for chapter 8, and now I'm going to jump into chapter 9, which is titled Learning Through Avoidance. To start out, he starts by saying that the lab rats learn something from every shock and every lever pull. If the rat sits and does nothing, it learns the punishment of that shock, and if the rat pulls the lever, they learn that they avoid the shock. Over time, the subject learns to take the straight and narrow path and just pull the lever, avoid the shock altogether, and never be punished. Pressing the lever is the safe option, the safe route. Sidman goes on to explain that even though the animal does not understand speech, they do understand the message that's sent across by the shock. Press the lever or else you'll get shocked. So by making these coercive practices in the lab hours, it allows us to directly see what else is really hard to see in the real world. It would be extremely hard to see that demonstrated in a real world setting, in a classroom, in a clinic, things that we're used to seeing. In the real world, it definitely happens over a longer period of time. And if we're lucky, it won't dominate our entire existence. He explains that parents who punish have established the coercive environment. They've coerced their children to behave because it's the safest option for them. If they misbehave, they might get spanked. They might have some sort of timeout. They might have some sort of punishment. So it's easier to behave to avoid that negative consequence that may come. Another example is few students work for A's. They might just be avoiding an F or a bad grade. Another example is police threaten arrest with fines and trials and prison if we don't obey the laws. We have learned through these different things how to avoid that negative behavior through coercion. And he says that if avoidance isn't possible, then escape is usually the next option. And that's what most people would do. But he did state and was very clear about it. Avoidance is always more dominant than escape because it's the most clear and narrow path. he says once we realize how much avoidance is imposed on us, it should really come as no surprise that we do it to others. We set up coercive practices to get what we want, to have other people avoid those negative behaviors. For example, do what I tell you, or do it my way. Things like that seems like the most common way that we teach others our expectations, what's right and what's proper. This happens because authority is shown through coercion and not really through positive reinforcement. We've seen that, especially in our current events of what's going on in Milwaukee and things like that. It's really not positive and reinforcement at all. He stated, and I'm going to quote him here, "We use avoidance contingencies extensively to establish and maintain academic skills, family interactions, sexual practices, social relationships, group customs, adherence to the law, political affiliations, moral values, business associations, and internal alliances." So it kind of covers a lot of ground. All of those different areas use avoidance techniques to essentially get what they want, which is a coercive practice. The next section of the chapter is called "What Goes Along with Avoidance and Keep Your Nose Out of Trouble." In the lab, rats pull the lever to avoid the shock, and then they engage in little else other than the lever pulling. They may also engage in grooming behaviors because they can do it at the same time. They can groom themselves and pull the lever, but they don't really leave the area. And if we were unaware of the animal's history, we would find it pretty hard to explain the dual occupation of grooming and pulling the lever. It might seem ritualistic, and he used the term autistic for the grooming, which I found pretty interesting. In terms of people, though, he says that people can learn through avoidance contingencies, and what they learn is to avoid and little else, which I thought was pretty interesting. The next section of chapter 9 was titled "Don't Rock the Boat." So he starts out this section by saying people who live lives of avoidance are often very negative and inflexible people. Avoiders rarely do the unexpected. They follow the same path. They do what they're told. To be given different options kind of frightens them and scares them. And they often say rules are not made to be broken. They're there for a reason. They avoid being blamed for a wrong decision by just not making any decisions at all. They leave it to everybody else. And they keep their nose out of trouble, which was the title of this section. And the final section was titled "Kill Them All." So he says that give us what you have or we will destroy all that you value. Which kind of summed up the chapter. And a good example of this was his use, was terrorists. And he explained that they kind of have this mentality that they have nothing to lose. And most terrorists are willing to lose everything in order to carry out these threats, including their lives. So that is my summary for chapter 9. And my question for you is, there are 2 causes for avoidance, which is our past and our present. Now, knowing this information, think about someone or something that you typically avoid. Why do you think you avoid that thing or that person? So I'm really excited to see what you guys have to say.